The settlement of New Prosperity had been standing for 3 years on the edge of the Kepler 442 system, and it was a human outpost on alien soil, where colonists had come seeking peace. But peace was something the galaxy rarely gave to anyone who asked for it. And Lieutenant Jake Morrison was watching the perimeter sensors from the command center when the alerts began screaming across every screen in front of him, and his coffee cup fell from his hand as he saw what was coming toward them through the atmosphere. And the Kresh raiders came at dawn with their ships cutting through the sky like razors through silk. And they were slavers who were notorious across 12 systems for their brutality and cruelty, and everyone in the outer colonies knew their name and feared it. The attack lasted only 17 minutes, but those 17 minutes changed everything for the people of New Prosperity. Because when the smoke finally cleared and the fires were put out, there were 23 colonists lying dead in the streets, and another 15 were missing. And among those missing people was Claire Donovan, who was the settlement's chief medical officer, and the woman Jake had planned to marry in just 2 months, and they had already sent out the invitations and picked the flowers, and now she was gone and taken by monsters who would sell her to the highest bidder. Somewhere in the dark corners of space where human law meant nothing, Governor Henry Phillips stood among the wreckage of what had been the main greenhouse, and his face was pale as he looked at the destruction around him. And he said they took them to the processing camps on Tharsis Ridge, and by tomorrow they'll be sold across the sector. And there's nothing we can do about it because the Kresh have diplomatic immunity under the Frontier Accords, and our hands are completely tied. And Jake stared at the blood-stained ground where Claire had been working, with her plants just an hour before the attack, and his hands were trembling, but not with fear, because what he felt was rage that burned cold and absolute in his chest. Jake turned to the governor and said, "Get me a ship," and his voice was quiet, but there was something in it that made Phillips take a step backward. And the governor shook his head and said, "The military won't mobilize for a rescue mission because it would violate too many treaties and start a diplomatic incident that could lead to war. And we have to think about the bigger picture here." And Jake looked at him with eyes that had gone flat and empty and said, "I didn't ask for permission, and I didn't ask about the military, and I asked for a ship." And Phillips understood then that this was not a request, but a statement of what was going to happen whether anyone approved or not. Jake Morrison had been a different man before he came to the colonies and before joining the settlement program. He had served 8 years in the deep-range reconnaissance units, which were soldiers who operated beyond all maps and laws in places where civilization ended and savagery began, and they called them Blood Riders after an old Earth legend about warriors who rode into hell itself and came back covered in the blood of their enemies, and Jake had been one of the best. And that was why he had retired, because there were things he had done that he could never speak about, and nightmares that woke him sweating in the dark hours before dawn. He still had his gear buried in a storage locker beneath his quarters, and he went there now, moving through the settlement like a ghost, and nobody tried to stop him, because they could see something had changed in him. And the peaceful colonist, they knew, was gone, and something older and more dangerous had taken his place. And he opened the locker and pulled out the black tactical suit that could bend light around the wearer and make him nearly invisible. And the pulse weapons that left no trace except dead bodies and the neural interface that connected directly to his brain and turned a normal man into something more than human and something deadly. In the shadow of a supply hangar, 3 other people were waiting for him, and they had all served together in the old days, and Danny Cooper was there with burns covering half his face from a mission gone wrong, and Lisa Hayes was checking her sniper rifle with the calm efficiency of someone who had killed more people than she could count. And old George Martin was running pre-flight checks on a shuttle that was definitely not supposed to leave the hangar, and when Jake arrived, they all looked up and nodded because they had known this moment would come eventually. Because men like them never really left the war behind, and the war never really left them. George said, "You know, this is suicide," and it wasn't a question, but just a statement of fact. And Jake was checking the charge on his weapons and said, "They have Claire, and they have 15 of our people, and I'm going in, whether you come with me or not." And Lisa shouldered her rifle and said, "We're all going in. But you need to understand something, Jake, because once we do this, we can't come back here. And the government will disavow us and we'll be outlaws for the rest of our lives. However long that is." And Jake said, "I'm already an outlaw because the moment I decided their laws matter less than her life, I stopped being a citizen and became something else entirely." They boarded the shuttle at midnight when the security patrols were at their lightest, and the transponder was dark, and the hull had been painted with special coating that drank the starlight and made them invisible to most sensors. And as they lifted off, Jake looked back once at New Prosperity and saw the lights of the settlement getting smaller below them, and he was looking at the life he was leaving behind and the man he used to be. And he didn't regret it for even a moment, because some things were worth burning your whole world down for, and Claire was one of those things, and he would tear the galaxy apart to get her back or die trying. Tharsis Ridge sat in the dead zone between 3 territorial claims, and it was a lawless stretch of rock and radiation where the Creche operated with complete impunity, and their camp sprawled across a canyon like a metal tumor with processing centers and slave pens radiating out from a central fortress that rose up from the red rocks like a monument to cruelty and suffering. And George brought the shuttle down 20 kilometers out from the camp and hid it in a ravine where the sensor scatter from the radiation would mask their presence from any patrols that might be sweeping the area. They moved on foot through the rust-colored wasteland, and the ground was hard beneath their boots, and the air tasted like copper and old blood. And Danny had his equipment out, detecting patrol patterns and movement signatures, and Lisa had her scope up, marking guard positions and calculating firing solutions, and Jake moved like a ghost through the rocks, and his training was flooding back with each step he took, and the deep range had taught him that civilization was just a thin veneer over something much older and darker, and out here in places like this there were only the old rules and the savage rules, and mercy was weakness and hesitation was death. They reached an overlook as the twin suns were setting, and the light bathed the camp below in crimson that made everything look like it was already covered in blood. And through his scope, Jake counted 43 Creche guards moving through the compound, and there were automated defenses on every wall with guns that tracked movement, and in the central yard he could see the prisoners in their cages, and they looked small and broken and defeated, and his hands tightened on his weapon as he searched for Claire among them. He found her in the third pen from the left, and her medical coat was torn and dirty, and her face was bruised, but she was standing straight, and her eyes were defiant, and she was tending to another prisoner who looked injured and something twisted in Jake's chest when he saw her. But he forced it down deep because emotion was a luxury he could not afford right now, and if he let himself feel what he was feeling, he would charge down there alone and get everyone killed, and that would not save her or anyone else. Lisa was studying the camp through her scope, and she said 3 guard towers with overlapping fields of fire, and the walls are shielded against direct assault, and if we go in loud, we die in seconds, and there's no way around it. And Danny was looking at his scanner and frowning, and he said the shields have a gap because they rely on the natural canyon walls on the north side, and if we could scale that cliff, we could drop directly into the compound and bypass the main defenses entirely. George whistled low and said that's a 100-meter vertical climb in the dark, and then we'd be trapped inside with no exit and no way to extract, and we'd be surrounded by hostiles with our backs against a wall. And Jake never looked away from Claire down in that cage, and he said then we make an exit. And Danny, how much explosive do you have with you? And the engineer grinned, and it wasn't a pleasant expression, and he said enough to make some noise, and maybe bring down a wall if we place it right. They moved at midnight when the guards grew lazy and bored, and the automated systems ran on minimal power to conserve energy, and the climb up the canyon wall took 3 hours, and each handhold was a gamble, and each minute stretched into eternity, and Jake could feel his muscles screaming as he pulled himself up the sheer rock face, and below him the others followed in silence. And they were professional soldiers on an impossible mission, and they had done impossible things before. But this felt different because this time it was personal. The night wind carried sounds from the camp below, and Jake could hear harsh laughter and machinery grinding, and occasionally there were screams that made his blood run cold, and he climbed faster because every moment they spent on this wall was another moment. Claire was down there suffering, and he had promised himself he would never let anything happen to her, and he had broken that promise, and now he would do whatever it took to make it right, even if it cost him everything. At the top they lay flat against the stone and watched, and the compound spread beneath them, like a map drawn in metal and misery, and the prisoner pens clustered in the center, and around them were guard barracks and armories and the main fortress, where the Creche commander coordinated the slave trade and planned which colonies to hit next, and Jake studied every detail and burned it into his memory, because he would need to know this place intimately if they were going to survive the next hour. Jake whispered the plan and said we hit the armory first and create chaos and draw them away from the prisoners. And Danny, you wire the north wall, and when we extract you blow it and open our exit route, and Lisa, you take the high ground and provide covering fire. And George, you stay with the shuttle and jam their communications and keep the engine hot because when we come out we'll be coming fast. And Lisa assembled her rifle with practiced efficiency and said, and if they call for reinforcements, before we can jam them. Jake said then we'll have maybe 10 minutes before ships arrive and 10 minutes to free 15 people and fight our way out through an army of slavers, and it's not ideal. But it's what we have. And Danny checked his charges and said, you know what? They'll call this back home and they'll call it an act of war because the Kresh have treaties, and we're about to violate every diplomatic agreement in the sector, and we'll be wanted criminals and terrorists, and everything we fought for will be branded as terrorism. Jake looked at him and his voice was cold iron, and he said, they violated something more important when they took our people, and they forgot that humans don't negotiate with slavers, and they forgot what we're capable of when you take what's ours. And they forgot that some of us never really stopped being warriors and never really left the war behind, and now they're going to remember. And he stood up and was outlined against the stars, and for a moment, he looked like something out of legend, and like the blood riders of old who answered to no law but their own code. Jake said, let's remind them what it means to cross humanity, and then they dropped into hell and there was no turning back and no second chances, and they were committed now to this course of action, and they would either free those prisoners or die trying, and Jake was fine with either outcome as long as Claire survived. The first guard died without making a sound, and Lisa's silent round punched through his skull as he was turning to light a cigarette, and he dropped like a puppet with cut strings, and Jake was already moving forward, and he was a shadow among shadows, and his blade found throats and hearts with surgical precision, and he had done this so many times before in so many dark places that it was almost automatic now, and 3 more guards went down before anyone realized something was wrong. They reached the armory in 90 seconds, and Danny placed his charges with the care of a surgeon, and his hands were steady despite the danger, and then they retreated to cover behind a supply container, and Danny triggered the detonator, and the explosion lit the night like a newborn sun and sent a fireball 200 feet into the air, and the shockwave knocked nearby guards off their feet and set off alarms throughout the compound. The alarms shrieked and screamed, and Kresh warriors poured from the barracks with weapons raised, and they were shouting in their clicking language, and Jake could see the confusion on their faces because they had thought themselves safe here in their fortress, and they had never expected anyone to be crazy enough to attack them. And he triggered the secondary charges in the armory, and the captured munitions inside exploded and tore through the compound and turned night into burning day. In the chaos, Jake sprinted for the prisoner pens, and his legs pumped and his lungs burned, and a Kresh guard stepped into his path with a plasma weapon raised, and Jake shot him twice in the center of mass, and then vaulted over the falling body, without breaking stride. And Lisa was on a rooftop somewhere covering him, and her rifle cracked methodically, and each shot dropped a target and cleared his path forward. He reached Claire's cage and tore the lock open with his enhanced strength, and the metal screamed and bent and broke. And Claire looked up at him with wide eyes and said, Jake, and what are you doing here? And how did you and he cut her off and pressed a weapon into her hands and said no time and get everyone ready to move, and she stared at the gun for a moment, and then her training kicked in, and she checked the charge with practiced efficiency and said, I'm a doctor, but I'm not a pacifist, and get us out of here. Jake moved to the next pen and freed the colonists inside, and they stared at him with hope and terror mixing on their faces, and some were wounded and barely able to walk, and one man was missing an arm, and the stump had been poorly cauterized. And Jake helped him up and pointed toward the north wall and said, that's where we're going, and stay low and follow Claire. And George's voice crackled in his ear through the comm system and said, Jake, we've got problems and they're organizing faster than expected, and I count 30 hostiles moving to surround the pens. Jake asked how long until Danny blows the wall, and George said 4 minutes, and Jake said, then we hold for 4 minutes, and he took position at the entrance to the pen area and raised his rifle, and the first wave of Kresh came around the corner in a tactical formation, and they were disciplined and deadly and better trained than he had expected, and he opened fire, and his neural interface was calculating trajectories faster than thought, and each burst found its mark, and bodies fell. But there were too many, and they kept coming like a tide. Blood slicked the ground beneath his feet, and bodies piled at the choke point, where Jake made his stand and his rifle overheated, and he discarded it and drew his sidearm, and then his blade, and the creche came at him like a tide of claws and teeth. And he met them with calculated violence, and every move was efficient and nothing was wasted. And he had been trained to fight like this and to hold impossible positions against impossible odds. Lisa's voice was tight with stress in his ear, and she said, "Jake, you're about to be flanked and I can't cover both angles and you need to fall back." And he said, "Then cover the colonists and I'll handle this." And he triggered a flashbang grenade and dove through the explosion and came up behind the flanking squad, and his blade sang through the air, and 4 creche fell before they even knew death had found them. But one got through his defense, and its claws raked across his ribs and tore through armor and flesh. Pain exploded through his side like fire, and he could feel blood running hot down his leg, but pain was just data, and he had learned long ago to ignore it and compartmentalize it and file it away for later. And he broke the creature's neck with his bare hands and turned to find a dozen more coming at him from multiple directions. And behind him Claire was organizing the colonists, and the wounded were being supported by the strong, and everyone was armed with whatever they could grab. She caught his eye across the chaos, and in that moment she saw what he had become, and what he had always been beneath the civilized veneer and the quiet man who grew flowers in the greenhouse. And she didn't flinch away from it, and instead, she raised her weapon and opened fire and covered his retreat. And he had never loved her more than in that moment when she proved she could be just as savage as him when it mattered. Danny's voice burst through the comm and said 30 seconds to breach and get to the north wall now. And Jake roared at the colonists and said, "Move and go and go and go." And they ran, and it was a desperate stream of humanity fleeing through smoke and fire. And Jake held the rear, and he was firing controlled bursts, and his body was moving on instinct and training and years of muscle memory. A creche captain came at him with a plasma blade that glowed blue-white, and they dueled in the firelight, and it was 2 warriors locked in lethal dance, and the captain was strong and fast, but Jake was faster and better trained, and his blade found the gap in the captain's armor and slid between the plates, and the alien fell with a gurgling scream, and black blood pooling beneath it. Danny counted down and said 10 seconds, and Jake sprinted after the colonists, and his wounded side screamed at him. But he ignored it, and the colonists were at the wall and pressed against it with nowhere to go, and the creche were closing from 3 sides, and it was a tightening noose, and they were trapped. And then Danny's charges blew, and the explosion tore through the wall like it was paper and opened a gap 20 feet wide, and beyond it, the canyon waited dark and free. And Jake commanded them and said through the breach, "And George, bring the shuttle up hot," and they started moving. But something was wrong, and Jake's combat instincts were screaming at him, and the creche weren't pursuing through the breach, and they had pulled back and were forming a semicircle around the opening, but not advancing and not firing and just waiting. And that was worse than an attack because it meant they had a plan, and Jake didn't know what it was, and not knowing could get everyone killed. Then the fortress doors opened with a grinding sound of metal on stone, and their commander emerged, and he was massive, and easily 8 feet of armored muscle and cold intelligence, and in one clawed hand he held what looked like a remote detonator, and his translated voice boomed across the compound through speakers mounted on his armor and said, "Human warriors, and you fight well, and I respect your courage, but you cannot win this fight." Jake stepped forward and placed himself between the monster and the colonists and said, "We're leaving, and try to stop us, and I'll burn this entire camp to bedrock, and I have enough explosives planted to turn this place into a crater." And the creche commander's mandibles clicked in what might have been laughter, and he said, "You have explosives, yes, and enough to damage my facility perhaps, but I have something more valuable than explosives." The commander raised the detonator higher so everyone could see it clearly, and said, "Collars and around the necks of your people, and one signal from this device, and they detonate, and your people die, and all your courage and all your fighting means nothing." And Jake's blood turned to ice in his veins, and he looked back at the colonists and saw it now, and the metal bands around each throat were so small and unobtrusive that they had been overlooked in the chaos and the fighting. Claire's hand went to her neck and felt the device there, and it was cold against her skin, and her eyes met Jake's across the space between them, and in those eyes he saw acceptance and understanding and love, and she knew what he was thinking, and she shook her head slightly as if to say, "It's okay, and don't do anything stupid for me." But Jake had already done stupid things, and he would do more before this night was over. The creche commander continued, and his voice was confident and smug, and he said, "You will surrender now, and your people will return to their pens, and you, Blood Rider, will die slowly, as an example to others who think they can defy the Kresh dominion, and we will make your death last for days and broadcast it across the sector, so everyone knows what happens to those who challenge us." The wind howled through the canyon and carried the smell of smoke and blood and burned metal, and every weapon in the compound was trained on Jake and waiting for his response. And the colonists behind him were silent and terrified, and Claire was watching him with tears running down her face, but she wasn't making a sound. Jake looked at Claire and at the other colonists and at the freedom that was just beyond the breach and so close they could almost taste it. And then he looked at the monster holding their lives in one clawed hand and the remote detonator that could end everything with just one press of a button. And Jake Morrison smiled, and it was not a pleasant expression, and it was the smile of a man who had nothing left to lose and everything to gain, and the smile of a blood rider who had ridden into hell before and survived. And the Kresh commander took an involuntary step backward when he saw that smile, because it was the smile of something dangerous and unpredictable. Jake said no, and his voice was simple and clear and carried across the compound, and the commander's mandibles spread wide in surprise, and he said, "You refuse, and I will kill them all, and every human here will die because you were too proud to. Surrender, and their blood will be on your hands." And Jake said, "You won't do it." The commander seemed genuinely confused now and said, "Why would I not kill them, and I have nothing to lose and everything to gain from making an example?" And Jake replied, "Because the moment you trigger that detonator, you die. And every Kresh in this camp dies, and this entire facility becomes a crater, and there won't be anything left but smoke and ash." He gestured to the compound around them and said, "You think these are all of Danny's charges, and we've been planting explosives since we arrived, and the armory was just the beginning, and the fuel depot is wired, and the power core is wired, and the barracks are wired, and all of it is ready to blow, and all of it is on a dead man's switch that triggers if my heart stops beating." It was a bluff, and a desperate, impossible bluff, because they only had charges on the north wall and nowhere else. And Danny had used everything he brought just to breach that wall, but Jake delivered the lie with such cold conviction and such absolute certainty that the commander hesitated, and doubt crept into his eyes. The commander said, "You're lying, and there's no way you had time to plant charges throughout my facility." And Jake tilted his head and said, "Am I lying? And there's one way to find out, and press that button and see if you survive the next 5 seconds, and see if your facility is still standing, or if it's a smoking crater." And the commander's hand trembled slightly on the detonator. Lisa's voice whispered in Jake's ear, and it was so soft that only he could hear through the comm, and she said, "Northwest tower and thermal exhaust and chain reaction possible if I hit the regulator, and it'll look like an explosion." And Jake's smile widened fractionally, and he said to the commander, "You wanted to make an example of me and let me make one of you instead." Jake continued, and his voice dropped lower and more dangerous, and he said, "This is what happens when you take humans, and this is what happens when you forget that some of us never stopped being savages, and we rode out of Earth's wars, and we brought the fire with us, and we burned our enemies on 100 worlds, and you think you can threaten us with death, and we make death our weapon." His hand moved fractionally toward the detonator on his belt, and it wasn't really a detonator, but the commander didn't know that. And the Kresh leader's eyes widened, and in that moment he saw his death and saw his facility destroyed, and saw everything he had built consumed in flame, and his hand trembled harder on the remote. Jake said, "Release them and remove the collars and let my people go and do this, and I'll let you live, and you can rebuild, and you can continue your operations, and I won't reduce this place to atoms." And the commander said, "And if I refuse, and what?" Then, and Jake's smile was cold as space, and he said, "Then we all burn together." Jake continued speaking and said, "When the authorities find this crater, they'll find a human who was willing to die to free his people, and they'll find a Kresh who thought humans would bow, and they'll find evidence of slave trading and treaty violations, and which do you think history will remember, and which do you think will start the war you've been trying to avoid?" The silence stretched between them, and it was the kind of silence that comes before thunder and before lightning and before the world changes forever. And every eye in the compound was on these two figures, and the standoff between them, and the question of who would blink first and who would back down, and who would survive the next 60 seconds. The Kresh commander was calculating, and Jake could see it in his eyes. And the alien was weighing the odds and trying to decide if the human was bluffing, and if he could afford to find out the hard way. And his mandibles clicked nervously, and his breathing had changed and become faster and more shallow. Jake stood perfectly still, and his weapon was trained on the commander's head. and his finger was on the trigger, and his other hand was near his belt where the fake detonator waited, and he knew that if this went wrong, then everyone died, and Claire died, and all of this had been for nothing. But he also knew that sometimes you had to bet everything on a single hand. Behind him, Claire was watching, and she understood what he was doing, and she understood the game he was playing, and she wanted to scream at him to stop and to surrender and to save himself. But she also knew that Jake Morrison had never surrendered in his life, and he wasn't going to start now, and especially not when it meant leaving her and the others in chains. The commander's hand tightened on the remote, and for a moment Jake thought it was over, and thought the alien was going to call his bluff and press the button, and then they would all find out together what happened when you pushed a blood rider too far. But then the hand relaxed and the commander's shoulders sagged just slightly. The alien said you would truly die for them, and Jake said without hesitation, and I would die for any one of them, and I would burn this facility and myself, and you and everything here to ash if it meant they went free. And that's the difference between us, and you see them as property and I see them as family. The commander was quiet for a long moment, and then he said, I have heard stories of the Blood Riders and of the human warriors who rode into the dark places and who came back, changed and covered in the blood of their enemies, and I thought they were legends and stories to frighten younglings, but you are real. And Jake said we were always real and we never went away and we just pretended to be civilized for a while. Jake said, now make your choice and live or die, but make it fast because my patience is running out, and I'm bleeding and I'm tired and I'm angry. And the longer you make me wait, the more likely I am to just detonate everything and let the pieces fall where they may. And the commander looked at him and saw the truth in his eyes. The Kresh commander slowly lowered the detonator, and his voice was bitter when he spoke, and he said, remove the collars, and his soldiers hesitated, and he roared it again and said, remove the collars now, and they moved among the colonists and began unlocking the deadly devices, and Claire was freed first, and the collar clattered to the ground, and she gasped in relief. One by one, the others were released and the collars fell away, and Jake never moved and never blinked, and his weapon stayed trained on the commander because he didn't trust this and didn't believe it was over until every single person was free and safe, and Lisa's voice in his ear said, I've got the shot, and just say the word and I'll drop him. Jake said not yet and wait and let them finish, and Danny's voice came through and said, charges are set on the backup systems, and if this goes sideways I can bring down the whole compound. And George said, shuttle is in position and guns are hot and we can light this place up on your command. The last collar came off and fell to the ground, and Jake said, now back away from the breach, and all of you. And the Kresh soldiers retreated and formed a line, but they didn't lower their weapons, and the commander stood there alone and said, you have what you came for, and now go before I change my mind. Jake began backing toward the breach, and his weapon never wavered, and he said, Claire, get everyone moving, and she organized the colonists, and they started filing through the breach and into the canyon beyond. And the wounded were helped by the strong, and nobody spoke and nobody made a sound except for quiet footsteps. Claire lingered at the breach and looked back at Jake and said, please, and just come with us now. And he said, go and I'll be right behind you, and I promise. But she knew that promises made in moments like this were fragile things, and she wanted to stay and drag him with her. But she also knew that someone had to get the others to safety. She ran through the breach and the others followed, and soon only Jake remained facing down an army. And the Kresh commander stood 50 feet away and said, this is not over, human, and you have made an enemy today that will hunt you across the stars. And Jake said, yes, it is over, because word of this will spread. Jake said word that the Blood Riders still hunt, and word that humans don't forgive and don't forget, and don't negotiate with slavers, and you'll think twice before raiding our colonies again, and every Kresh in this sector will hear what happened here tonight, and they'll hear that one human walked into your fortress and walked out alive. The commander's mandibles clicked in what might have been grudging respect and said, you are either very brave or very insane. And Jake said, maybe I'm both, and maybe that's what makes humans dangerous, and maybe that's what you should have remembered before you took what was mine. George's shuttle roared up from the canyon, and its guns were trained on the compound, and the targeting lasers painted red dots across the commander's chest. And Lisa and Danny were providing covering fire from their positions, and Jake reached the breach and paused at the threshold between captivity and freedom. Jake said, and if you don't think twice, and if you ever touch New Prosperity again or any colony under my protection, then I'll come back. And next time I won't bluff about the explosives, and next time I won't give you a choice, and next time I'll burn everything and everyone and leave nothing but ashes. And the commander believed him. Then Jake was gone and dropping into the canyon, and the shuttle's cargo bay was opening to receive him, and he landed hard on the metal deck, and his wounded side screamed in protest. but he rolled to his feet and shouted, "Go," and George slammed the throttle forward and the shuttle leaped into the sky like a startled bird. Behind them, Danny triggered the charges they had actually planted, and the north wall of the compound collapsed in thunder and flame, and tons of rock and metal came crashing down and buried the breach and sealed the creche inside their own facility. And it would take them hours to dig out, and by then the humans would be long gone. In the shuttle, Claire was already working on Jake's wounds, and she had torn open his tactical suit and was packing the claw marks with medical foam, and her hands were steady despite everything they had just been through. And she said, "You're an idiot, and you know that," and he said, "Yes, but I'm your idiot," and she laughed, and it was half sob and half relief. The freed colonists huddled together in the cargo bay, and they were processing their freedom, and some were crying, and some were silent, and some were just staring at nothing. And the man with the missing arm was being tended to by another colonist, who had medical training, and Danny and Lisa climbed aboard through the still open bay door. George plotted a course to independent space, and punched it into the navigation computer and said, "We need to get out of creche territory before they scramble fighters." And he sent the shuttle into a steep climb that made everyone grab for handholds, and the stars wheeled overhead as they broke atmosphere. Jake sat against the bulkhead while Claire finished patching him up, and he watched the freed colonists and saw their faces and saw their freedom, and it had been worth it. And every risk and every wound and every law he had broken had been worth it to see them free, and to see Claire alive. Lisa dropped down beside him and checked her rifle and said, "That was the craziest thing I've ever seen. And I've seen some crazy things. And you bluffed a creche commander with nothing but attitude and a fake detonator." And he said, "Sometimes all you have is attitude, and you have to make it enough." Danny was grinning and said, "Did you see his face when you threatened to blow everything, and he actually believed you, and I almost believed you?" And Jake said, "The trick is to believe it yourself. And if you believe the lie, then they'll believe it, too, and conviction is more powerful than truth sometimes." George called back from the cockpit and said, "We've got clean scans and no pursuit, and I think they're too busy digging out to come after us. And besides, we're crossing into neutral territory now, and they can't follow without starting an incident." And Jake closed his eyes and let out a breath he felt like he'd been holding for hours. Claire finished the bandaging and sat back and looked at Jake and really looked at him and said, "Who were you before New Prosperity? And what did you do in those 8 years you never talk about?" And he said, "I was someone I tried to leave behind and someone I hoped I'd never have to be again." She touched his face gently and said, "And now, and what are you now?" And he gazed out at the stars through the viewport, and at the vast darkness where humans had spread and carried their old ways to new worlds, and said, "Now I'm someone who remembered that some things are worth burning for." The shuttle hummed through space and left the creche territory behind, and headed for the free colonies where questions weren't asked, and where outlaws could disappear if they were careful, and Jake knew they could never go back to New Prosperity, and never return to the lives they had built there. One of the freed colonists came over, and it was a young woman named Kate Harper, and she knelt down in front of Jake and said, "Thank you." And her voice was thick with emotion and said, "You didn't have to come for us, and you didn't have to risk everything." And Jake said, "Yes, I did, because you're one of us." She started crying then and said they were going to sell us and separate us, and we would never have seen home again, or seen our families, and we would have died as slaves on some distant world. And Jake said, "But you didn't, and you're free, and you're going home." And she hugged him, and he awkwardly patted her back. The other colonists came forward one by one and thanked him and thanked Danny and Lisa and George, and some shook hands and some hugged them, and some just nodded, because words weren't enough for what had been done and what had been risked, and Claire watched it all with tears streaming down her face. George set the autopilot and came back to the cargo bay and said, "We'll reach the free port of Meridian Station in about 6 hours, and from there we can scatter and disappear and find new lives under new names." And Jake said, "Or we could stay together." And George raised an eyebrow and said, "Stay together and do what?" Jake said, "There are more colonies out there and more slavers and more people who need help, and who need someone willing to break the rules and cross the lines and do what needs to be done. And we're good at this, and we could keep doing it." Lisa cleaned her rifle and said, "You're talking about becoming vigilantes and criminals and wanted to cross half the sector." And Jake said, "I'm talking about being what we always were, and blood riders who hunt in the dark places and protect those who can't protect themselves." Danny considered it and said it would be dangerous and we'd be hunted and we could never stop running and we could never settle down and live normal lives. And Jake said, "When have any of us ever lived normal lives, and when have we ever wanted to?" Claire spoke up and said, "If you're going to do this, then you need a doctor, and someone to patch you up when you do stupid things. And Jake started to protest and said no, and you've been through enough. And you should take the colonists somewhere safe and live a peaceful life. She cut him off and said, I didn't survive slavery and a rescue mission just to sit on some quiet colony while you get yourself killed doing the next impossible thing, and I'm coming with you, and that's final. And Jake looked at her and saw the steel in her eyes and knew there was no arguing. George laughed and said, well then, and I guess we're doing this and we're becoming outlaws and heroes and probably getting killed, but at least it won't be boring. And Lisa said, I'm in because someone needs to keep you idiots alive. And Danny said, same, and someone needs to blow things up, and I'm good at that. The shuttle flew on through the night of space, and inside were 8 people who had been soldiers and colonists and victims and rescuers, and now they were something new, and something the galaxy hadn't seen in a long time, and they were Blood Riders reborn. Back at the Kresh compound, the commander stood among the ruins and watched the shuttle disappear into the stars and become just another point of light against the infinite dark, and his second-in-command came to stand beside him and clicked a question in their language and asked, do we pursue them? The commander looked at the collapsed wall and the burning buildings and the bodies of his warriors scattered across the compound, and some were dead from bullets, and some from explosions, and some from that human's blade. And he thought about the man who had walked into an enemy fortress and walked out alive. He thought about the human who had faced down an army with nothing but will and bluff, and the savage certainty that some lines should never be crossed, and the commander had been a warrior for 30 years, and had fought on a dozen worlds, and he recognized a true killer when he saw one. The commander said no and let them go, and his second-in-command was confused and said, but they killed our warriors and destroyed our facility and freed our merchandise, and we cannot let this stand. And the commander turned to look at him and said, you don't understand what just happened here. He continued and said, that was not a soldier, and that was not even a warrior, and that was something else entirely. And that was what the humans call a blood rider, and they are the ones who rode into the dark places during the human wars and came back changed and covered in the blood of their enemies. The second-in-command said, but they are just stories and legends to frighten younglings. And the commander shook his head and said, I thought so too until tonight, and until I looked into that human's eyes and saw that he meant every word and would have killed us all without hesitation. The commander walked through the compound and surveyed the damage and calculated the cost and said, send word to all Kresh vessels and all slave operations in this sector, and the colony at New Prosperity is forbidden territory, and mark it on all charts, and no one is to raid that colony or any colony that human protects. His second-in-command protested and said the council will not accept this, and they will say we show weakness and we bow to humans. And the commander said the council was not here tonight, and the council did not see what I saw, and the council does not understand that some prey bites back. He said, tell them we lost a battle but prevented a war, and if we had killed those humans, then every human colony in this sector would have risen against us, and they would have sent their soldiers and their ships and their blood riders, and we would have been destroyed. The second-in-command finally understood and bowed his head and said it will be done, and the warning will be sent. And the commander looked up at the stars one last time and thought about the human who had beaten him, not with superior force, but with superior will. Meanwhile, the shuttle reached Meridian Station, and George brought them in through the smuggler's entrance, and they docked without registering with station authority, and the freed colonists disembarked, and they had been given false identities and enough credits to start new lives wherever they chose. Kate Harper was the last to leave, and she stopped in the airlock and looked back at Jake and said, what you did tonight, and people need to know about it, and people need to know that there are still humans who fight for others. And Jake said no, and let it be a story and let it be a legend, and that's more powerful than truth. She nodded and said, then I'll tell the story, but I'll change the names and I'll make it a legend, and I'll tell it to everyone I meet, so they know that the Blood Riders still hunt and still protect. And she left, and Jake hoped she would be safe. The 4 of them and Claire stayed on the shuttle, and George plotted a course to a repair station where they could fix the damage and restock supplies, and Jake was already thinking about the next mission and the next colony that might need help. Claire came to sit beside him in the cargo bay and said, you know, we can never go home and we can never see our families again, and we're wanted criminals now. And Jake said, I know, and I'm sorry, and I never meant to drag you into this. And she laughed and said, you didn't drag me anywhere, and I chose this. She said, I chose you and I chose this life and I chose to stand with you against the darkness, and Jake took her hand and said, then let's make it official, and when we get to the repair station, let's find someone who can marry us. Claire smiled, and it was the first real smile he had seen from her since the raid. And she said, you're proposing to me in a cargo bay on a stolen shuttle while we're running from the law. And he said, yes. And is that a problem? And she kissed him and said no, and it's perfect. 3 months passed and they took on 6 missions and freed 43 slaves and destroyed 2 processing centers. And the rumors started to spread across the sector, and people whispered about the Blood Riders who had returned and about the humans who couldn't be stopped. New Prosperity received a supply shipment one day, and buried in the cargo was an unmarked crate, and inside was Jake's old military commendation and a note in Governor Phillips' handwriting, and it said, the council disavows your actions and the military disavows your actions and the government cannot acknowledge what you did. The note continued and said, but the people do not disavow you and the people remember, and the people are grateful and thank you for reminding us what it means to be human. And Jake read the note 3 times and then burned it, but he kept the commendation. He hung it in the small quarters he shared with Claire on the ship they had acquired, and it was next to their wedding photo that George had taken at a repair station chapel, and they looked happy in the photo, and free in a way they had never been before. Sometimes at night, Jake would look up through the viewport at the stars and remember the creche commander's eyes, and the moment fear had replaced arrogance, and he would remember what he had been, and what he had become, and what he would always be beneath the surface. He was a blood rider and a savage in civilized clothes and a human who answered the oldest call, which was the call that said, protect your own, no matter the cost, and no matter the price, and no matter what laws you had to break. Claire would find him at the viewport and wrap her arms around him and rest her head on his shoulder and say, what are you thinking about? And he would say, I'm thinking about the next mission and the next people who need help. And she would say, then let's go help them. And they would, and they did, and the legend grew and spread, and in quiet corners of 100 colonies, people told stories about the Blood Riders who hunted slavers and freed prisoners and disappeared into the night like ghosts. 2 years had passed since the raid on Tharsis Ridge, and Jake stood on the bridge of their ship, and it was called the Night Runner, and it was a converted military corvette that George had somehow acquired through channels that were better left unexamined, and they had modified it for their specific needs. The crew had grown, and there were now 12 of them, and each one was a former soldier or colonist who had been wronged by slavers or pirates or the corrupt officials who turned blind eyes to suffering, and they all shared the same code and the same willingness to cross lines that others would not cross. Danny had become their chief engineer and had turned the Night Runner into something special with weapons hidden in cargo bays and shields that could take a beating and engines that could outrun most patrol ships, and Lisa was their tactical officer and ran training drills that kept everyone sharp. George was still their pilot, and he was getting old now, and his hair was completely gray, but his hands were steady on the controls, and he could thread the ship through an asteroid field blindfolded, and Claire ran the medical bay and patched up wounded crew members and sometimes wounded people they rescued. Jake stood at the command station and studied the intelligence report that had come in through their network of informants, and it was about a new slave operation on the edge of the Deneb sector, and they were taking children from farming colonies and selling them to labor operations in the deep mines. He called the crew together and briefed them on the mission and said this one is going to be harder than usual, because the operation is run by a combine of 3 different slaver groups, and they've pooled resources and security, and will be outnumbered 3 to 1. One of the newer crew members, and a young man named Peter Cole, raised his hand and said, "Is it worth the risk, and how many children are we talking about?" And Jake said the last report counted 37 children, and the youngest is 6 years old. And Peter nodded and said, "Then it's worth it." They spent a week planning and gathering intelligence, and Lisa mapped out the facility, and Danny prepared special charges that could cut through reinforced walls, and George plotted escape routes and backup routes and emergency routes, because they always planned for things to go wrong. Claire came to Jake the night before the mission and said, "I'm scared, and not for me but for you and for all of us, and what if this is the mission where our luck runs out?" And Jake held her and said, "Then we die doing something that matters." She pulled back and looked at him and said, "Do you ever regret it? And do you ever wish we had just stayed at New Prosperity and lived quiet lives and grown old together in peace?" And he thought about it and said no, and not for a single moment. He said, I regret the people we couldn't save and the missions we arrived too late for, and the children who died in slavery before we could reach them, and I regret every moment we waste not fighting, but I don't regret choosing this life. Claire kissed him and said good, because neither do I, and tomorrow we go save 37 children, and then we find the next mission, and the next one after that until someone stops us or we stop ourselves. The mission went wrong from the start, and they had bad intelligence, and the facility had twice the security they expected, and the firefight lasted 3 hours, and they lost Peter Cole when a plasma bolt caught him in the chest, and he died saving a little girl who couldn't have been more than 7. But they got the children out, and all 37 of them, and they burned the facility to the ground and left the slavers dead or running, and on the flight back, Jake stood over Peter's body and said a prayer in the old way, and promised that his sacrifice would be remembered. They delivered the children to a safe colony that had agreed to take them and find their families, or adopt them to new ones, and the children cried and hugged the crew, and one little girl gave Jake a drawing she had made, and it showed a stick figure man fighting monsters, and she said, that's you and you're a hero. Jake kept the drawing and put it in his quarters next to the wedding photo and the military commendation, and the dozens of other mementos from people they had saved, and missions they had completed, and he looked at them sometimes and wondered if they were making a difference. Claire found him there one evening and said, you're brooding again, and he said, I'm thinking about Peter and about how many more we're going to lose. And she said, as many as it takes, because this is what we chose, and this is who we are. Reports kept coming in, and more slavers were shutting down operations, and more colonies were being left alone, and the creche had completely withdrawn from several sectors, and word had spread about the Blood Riders, and what happened to those who crossed them. The galactic authorities were looking for them, and there were warrants and bounties and official condemnations, but there were also quiet messages from colonial governors and settlement leaders who thanked them and provided intelligence and helped them when they could. Jake received a message one day through an encrypted channel, and it was from Governor Phillips at New Prosperity, and it said, you should know that a creche delegation came to the colony last week, and they offered a formal apology and reparations for the raid, and they signed a treaty promising never to raid human colonies again. The message continued and said they said it was because of diplomatic pressure, but we know the real reason, and we know it was because you taught them that humans bite back, and the governor said the colony is thriving now, and we built a memorial to those who died in the raid, and we put your name on it even though officially you don't exist. Jake read the message 3 times and showed it to Claire, and she smiled and said, see, and we are making a difference, and he said, maybe, but the work is never done. And she said, then we keep working. 5 years after Tharsis Ridge the Night Runner had become something of a legend, and there were songs about it in colonial bars and stories told around fires, and children played games where they pretended to be blood riders fighting slavers. Jake was older now and had more scars and more gray in his hair, but his eyes were still sharp and his hands were still steady, and he stood on the bridge and looked at his crew and thought about how far they had come. They had freed over 400 people and destroyed 23 slaver operations and changed the balance of power in 3 sectors, and the slave trade had decreased by 40% in the regions where they operated, but there were still more slaves and still more operations and still more children being taken in the night, and Jake knew they would never stop and never rest until every human in the galaxy was free, or until they were dead. Claire came to stand beside him and took his hand and said, what are you thinking? And he said, I'm thinking about the next mission, and she laughed and said, of course you are. And he smiled and said, and I'm thinking about how lucky I am. She raised an eyebrow and said, lucky? And we're outlaws running from the law and living on a ship and fighting impossible battles. And he said, yes, and lucky, because I get to do it with you. The comm system beeped, and Lisa's voice came through and said, we've got a priority message, and it's from a colony called Haven's Rest, and they're reporting slaver activity and requesting assistance. And Jake looked at Claire and she nodded. He keyed the comm and said, plot a course and maximum speed and tell them we're coming. And Lisa said affirmative and course plotted, and George said we'll be there in 18 hours. And Jake said good, because 18 hours is 18 hours too long. The Night Runner turned in space, and its engines flared bright, and it leaped into faster-than-light travel and disappeared into the darkness between stars, and inside were warriors who had chosen to fight and to protect, and to never stop fighting. Jake Morrison stood at his station and thought about the man he had been before the raid, and before Claire was taken, and before he remembered what it meant to be a blood rider, and he was grateful for that man because without him, this man could not exist. And he thought about the future and about all the missions yet to come, and all the people yet to save, and he knew that someday they would fail, and someday they would fall, but until that day came, they would keep riding into the darkness, and keep bringing the fire and keep reminding the galaxy that humanity protected its own, and that some things were worth burning everything for and dying for and killing for. The stars streamed past the viewport and the night runner flew on, and somewhere ahead was another colony, and another fight and another chance to prove that humans don't bow, and humans don't break, and humans sure as hell don't negotiate with slavers. And Jake smiled because he was home. And this was where he belonged, and this was who he had always been meant to be.